The fight for Red Bull's second F1 seat just got a lot spicier as the two main contenders for it collided on track, had a war of words off it, and a clear winner emerged both times. Sergio Perez's fight with Liam Lawson took on new meaning in the Mexican Grand Prix as they clashed on track in a battle that incensed Perez. Throw in Lawson showing Perez the middle finger later in the same race and Perez calling for Red Bull to intervene afterwards, and this is an escalation into a much more direct rivalry. Both Perez and Lawson are chasing the seat alongside Max Verstappen next year, and Perez has the advantage as the incumbent driver. Until now, the focus has only been on who does the best job with the equipment they are given in different teams and how Red Bull rates them. But there's proper needle between them now. Perez says he has no relationship with Lawson, which isn't an ideal starting point for two drivers in the same Red Bull family, and means that the final four races could get extra pointed if they ever come across each other again. Perez's home race could not have gone any worse, although we'll explain that properly later on, in the context of his desperate fight to hang on to his Red Bull seat. Even though he has a contract until the end of 2026, he's just lost two key battles with his main threat Lawson in the same race. Lawson wasn't punished by officials for his collision with Perez in the Grand Prix, and Red Bull didn't really care either, certainly not enough to give Perez the response he was hoping for. The incident in Mexico came with both drivers on the same strategy and fighting for track position as Perez tried to recover from a miserable Q1 exit. Perez threw a late lunge down the inside of Lawson into the slow turn 4 left-hander, and Lawson just about left room, but Perez then forced Lawson off the track. He expected Lawson to yield, but Lawson didn't. The track goes right again very quickly in that complex of 90-degree corners, and having gone off to avoid a collision, Lawson decided to hang on so he had the inside line for the next part. Perez went wide into the runoff on the exit and Lawson kept the place. The stewards took no action as they felt Perez's initial move was late and had forced Lawson off the track, so what happened next was just a racing incident, aka Lawson won. There was another minor flashpoint later in the race when Lawson passed Perez onto the start-finish straight. Lawson stuck his middle finger up at Perez as he overtook because he felt Perez had deliberately held him up for half a lap when Lawson came out of the pits on fresh tyres and caught the Red Bull again. While Lawson admitted he had a hot-headed moment in the race, Perez was left fuming afterwards, as the damage picked up in the original contact cost him about 70 points of downforce that he reckoned was worth 2 seconds a lap. Perez eventually finished last of the classified finishers, having stopped late on to put softs on for an unsuccessful run at fastest lap, although Lawson was only one place higher in the end as he was on the wrong strategy, then got hit by Williams driver Franco Colapinto and had to pit with his own damage. After the race came Perez's second loss. He absolutely laid into Lawson, accusing him of being disrespectful to senior drivers after his initial flare-up with Fernando Alonso in Austin last week, having the wrong attitude and needing to be more humble, and urging the Red Bull hierarchy to intervene. But they didn't, not really. In a very telling response, Red Bull team boss Christian Horner didn't side with Perez. Lawson had no instruction to let Perez by and was free to race him, partly because the two teams are meant to be independent, but let's be real, partly because Perez was so off it this weekend, he was in the moment an actual rival for position for Lawson. Red Bull senior advisor Helmut Marko was a bit more critical of Lawson directly, stating that he felt Lawson was the more guilty party in the clash and was too strong against another Red Bull driver. But even that seemed unusually subdued. Normally we would expect Red Bull, and especially the inimitably blunt Marko, to take a very dim view of such an incident given it cost the senior team points. Red Bull Racing has dropped to third in the Constructors' Championship, a slump Perez is chiefly responsible for given his poor form. So the clash with Lawson could easily have ended in Red Bull reprimanding its junior driver for a misjudgment and maybe even sharing Perez's view that it showed a temperament ill-suited to F1. That's not really what happened. While Marko sort of sided with Perez, he's not exactly let rip in his usual way. And given what Marko tends to look for in a driver, we wonder if the prospect of the two candidates for a race seat ending up wheel-to-wheel on track is his perfect way of judging them. Ultimately, Red Bull didn't really have anything to say in defense of Perez after this incident or this weekend as a whole. The lack of vocal support for him spoke volumes, and it clearly looks like advantage Lawson for 2025. There's something obvious you might be thinking. Why was Perez even racing with an RB anyway? Perez's nightmare race in Mexico may well be his last one on home soil, not just for Red Bull but in F1 at all, given he doesn't seem to have any other options if he does get dropped at the end of the year. This was a new low for Perez in his current confidence crisis. Everything about the weekend went wrong. An awful qualifying performance, a bafflingly amateur penalty he got for lining up on the grid way outside his slot, the clash with Lawson, and the fact this all added up to finishing last. And it was the worst time for Perez to suffer the most bitter disappointment yet in a self-described terrible season. Before the Grand Prix, Perez was tasked with beating McLaren's Oscar Piastri to assist Red Bull's championship bid. Piastri was starting one place ahead after a qualifying disaster of his own, and Perez actually did the hard bit with a great start and opening lap. But this good work was already partly undermined by the needless penalty, and then the Lawson clash wrecked it entirely. It's desperately unfortunate for Perez, who is a popular driver and is nowhere near as bad as he looked in Mexico or has looked for much of this season. He's just spiralled into a more limited version of himself. But despite his reprieve from Red Bull having almost been dropped in the summer break, his form has continued to be unconvincing at best. A much more competitive Azerbaijan weekend now looks like a grand exception, and what happened in Mexico was rock bottom. Perez didn't have an upgraded Red Bull floor in Austin and was missing most of it in Mexico too, but that didn't explain a Q1 exit with a lap 8/10 slower than Verstappen, who once again qualified on the front row. Perez claims he's been struggling with braking for multiple events now, not just Mexico, where he couldn't attack the big stops at the end of the main straight or into turn 4. Rather than an obvious technical or mechanical issue, it seems Perez's confidence on the brakes has been sapped. This was already evident in the US, but the low grip nature of the Mexico City circuit and the 90-degree slow corners that make up the opening sector punish the feeling Perez describes even more. Without full comfort and confidence on the brakes, Perez can't attack the braking zones without compromising his corner entry through corner speed and corner exit. The rear instability causes the rear end to slide, which costs lap time and increases tyre temperature. It set Perez up for his hiding in Mexico. Maybe getting the last of the Red Bull floor upgrade will help, but if Perez doesn't find a way to get on top of this, then these final races are going to be a real struggle as well. While Perez's bad season looks at real risk of having a similarly bad end, Lawson continues to build a reputation for himself as a very confident and forceful driver who is taking advantage of his big Red Bull opportunity. Learning another new track put him on the back foot in Mexico, and he didn't have the successful upgrade Yuki Tsunoda had either, but Lawson's progression was obvious, and by qualifying he was pretty much on pace with his more experienced teammate. Lawson's got the confidence of a driver who's enjoying things falling his way at the moment, which is an obvious contrast to Perez and Tsunoda, who was the faster RB driver in Mexico and had been rapid until he made a small but costly misjudgment in Q2. Tsunoda had a front lockup on the entry to the stadium section, then lost the rear and crashed into the wall. That prevented a likely double Q3 appearance for his team, but also helped championship rival Haas get both cars into Q3 instead, which meant Tsunoda was directly responsible for a significant swing in favour of RB's main competitor. And Red Bull views it as evidence of a mental fragility that undermines Tsunoda's obvious pace. Tsunoda knew the speed he had this weekend, and his team's typically strong pace in Mexico made this a big missed opportunity. Maybe that played a role in him crashing out at the first corner in the race. Red Bull might look on that a little less critically, given it was a bit unfortunate, but it had the air of a desperate attempt to make amends for qualifying. Tsunoda refused to back out of a risky move down the outside into turn 1, having already been briefly forced onto the grass as cars jostled for position, and put himself needlessly in harm's way with a high-risk move. Tsunoda's never been a Red Bull priority, but is rapidly falling out of the reckoning entirely. He's hopeful that finally testing a Red Bull F1 car in the post-season test in Abu Dhabi in December will be a vital late opportunity to make his case to the top team directly and dispel some concerns firsthand. But this idea has been in the works for several months, having been pursued by Tsunoda's primary backer Honda. It's not happening for Red Bull's benefit. If Lawson was behind the wheel in Abu Dhabi, it would feel a lot more significant. Although based on how his fight with Perez has started, Red Bull might not need to wait that long to make up its mind for 2025, which Tsunoda is more likely to spend at the second team as the benchmark for whoever his teammate will be.